Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Jonathan Alter. Jonathan is a journalist, best-selling author, Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker, and television producer, and he has interviewed many ex-presidents: President Nixon, President Ford, President Carter, President Bush, President Clinton, President W. Bush, and President Obama. He runs a newsletter called All Goats, Ruminating with Friends. And today we will speak about his latest book, his very best, Jimmy Carter, Alive. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. I'm glad to be here, Ellen.
What an amazing life story you have, or what an amazing uh, list of accomplishment writing, producing, television. It's just amazing. I wonder if we could start with a little bit of background of your life story. How is it that you managed to do so many things?
um, I guess it's mostly because I like variety. I like mixing it up, especially since I spent the first 28 years of my career, or close to the first 28 years. I had one job before this, but my main job was at Newsweek magazine, the old Newsweek, which was very popular all over the world. And I was an editor and I wrote a column there. And then when that ended about 10 years ago, I had already branched out into television and had already been working for about 15 years at that point, part time for NBC News. But I continued with that and tried to branch out into book writing and documentary filmmaking and producing television entertainment, which kind of happened a little bit by accident and is more of a lucky strike than something that I really planned on. And but variety is fun, and I'm kind of in the gig economy now where I do a lot of different things, as many different things as I can find the time for. And I guess it would be fair to say that I got that trait a little bit from my parents, who used to always say, if you need something done, ask a busy person. And they always had a lot of balls in the air at the same time when I was growing up in Chicago.
And what drove you towards interviewing all these presidents? I mean, that seems to be the main topic of your books, and I mean, you have been interviewing presidents since President Ford.
Yeah, actually, Nixon.
Yes, Nixon.
So nine American presidents I've interviewed either before, during, or after their presidencies. And that really goes back a really long way for me. So um, other kids like to play with dinosaurs or, do science experiments or read comic books. And I, from the time I was very young, was very interested in the presidents. And I actually memorized all the presidents in order and learned to say them all in order in under 30 seconds. I don't think you can do that with the prime ministers of Canada. It's a rather elite skill. And although I've taught it to my own kids, our own kids can also do that. And my late father, used to say I was the only American historian who didn't know how to read, because I was very interested in the presidents when I was in kindergarten. And there's a picture of me holding the hand of a mannequin of Abraham Lincoln in his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, when I went down to visit when I was 4 years old. And then pretty soon in life, because my mother was in politics, she was the first woman elected in the Chicago area in Cook County. And so I started to meet a lot of politicians, senators, and governors. And the first president I shook hands with was Ford when I was an intern on Capitol Hill when I was just out of high school. And then when I was in college, I was an intern in Jimmy Carter's speechwriting office. I only met Carter just for a minute that summer, but when I got to Newsweek, where I covered media and politics, I started covering presidential campaigns and met and got to know presidential candidates, successful and unsuccessful. And so by the time we got to the Clinton administration, I was interviewing him in the Oval Office every year of his presidency until he ran into trouble, in part because of some stories by one of my Newsweek colleagues who did did the Monica Lewinsky stories, and so for a while, I was kind of aced out of talking to Clinton. But then after he left office, I did the first interview with him about a year after he left office, also for Newsweek. And then Barack Obama, I had known since he was an Illinois state senator and failed congressional candidate. And I knew him through family connections in Chicago. So I started interviewing him pretty regularly when he uh, arrived in Washington as a senator in 2005. And then he was elected in 2008. And I continued to have at least some access to him. I've done worse with Republicans, but I did go to Gerald Ford's home and interview him at one point, and I interviewed George W. Bush on the campaign trail, and Nixon in a group with other Newsweek reporters in 1988. Although I set it up and arranged to meet Nixon because I always wanted to. And then Trump, I just interviewed before he became president. About more than 20 years ago, I interviewed Trump in New York, and I had no interest in interviewing him uh, after he became a candidate because I knew by that point that quite literally every word that comes out of his mouth is a lie. So interviewing him is pointless because the only reason to interview somebody is to get a little bit closer to the truth.
Well, great. And so at one moment in your life, you said, okay, so I mean, you have written already biographies of other previous presidents. What make you decide to write a biography on Jimmy Carter?
So my earlier books on presidents had not been biographies. I did a book about Franklin Roosevelt and his first 100 days as president in 1933, when the United States was curled up in the fetal position. It was the depths of the Great Depression. And so that was really, it had some background on Roosevelt, but it was really about a particular moment. And then my first Obama book was about, which is called The Promise, President Obama Year One, is about his first year in office. And my second Obama book is about Obama and his enemies. But this time I was looking around for a new book to write after the second Obama book came out, and I'm in a book club in New York City, and Jimmy Carter came as a guest when we were reading a book about the Camp David Accords, where Israel and Egypt made peace after 4 wars, and they haven't fired a shot in anger since. It's the most enduring major peace treaty of the post war era. And so Carter spoke that night to our book club about Camp David, and he talked some about human rights, his human rights policy, and how that helped lead to a democratic revolution around the world and many nations moving toward democracy. And I started to think, this guy has to be more complicated. There has to be more to him than the easy shorthand of, bad president, great former president. That was simplistic. I started to realize that had to be simplistic. And I had been, as I mentioned, I'd been an intern in his White House, and I'd interviewed him when I was at Newsweek when he was on a Habitat for Humanity site. He was on a construction site building housing for the poor. in 2000, I guess was the year I interviewed him. So I knew, something about him. And it turned out that my editor at my publishing house was also Carter's editor. And so she thought this was a fantastic idea. And she smoothed the way for me. And I got a tremendous amount of access to President Carter and his very formidable wife, Rosalind Carter, and their entire family. And so at that point in 2015, I was off and running. But when you do a big biography where you really want to do it right, I ended up interviewing 250 people and spending a lot of time at the Carter Library in Atlanta and in other archives. So I really wanted to do this one right, and that's why I quibbled over my other ones being biographies, because biographies they're kind of a different animal, and this was my first and possibly last one because they
Wow.
are a tremendous amount of work if you want to do them properly.
Well, there's this popular soundbite that goes like this: "Is the economy stupid?" Would you say, or would you believe that maybe why he didn't get elected was because the economy was going through difficult times at that time?
Yes, and I know that your show deals with money issues, and I'm really glad that you raised this because I think most people believe that Carter lost to Ronald Reagan because of the Iran hostage crisis, and he was unable to get the hostages released. And then, that was a factor, and it was also a factor that Ted Kennedy, a fellow Democrat, challenged Carter in the Democratic primary, so he didn't have a unified Democratic Party. That was a factor. But I believe the most important factor was the economic condition of the country. And when Ronald Reagan, in their only debate, turned to the audience, the camera, and he said, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" Most Americans of all political stripes had to say no, they weren't, because uh, interest rates at one point hit 19%. Can you imagine? 19%. And they were around 15% at the time of the election. And inflation was double digits. Unemployment was kind of up and down. It never broke 10%, but it got uncomfortably high, up 6, 7% at one point. And so the economy was just bad. The irony is that Carter was so focused on the future, on doing what was right rather than what was politically popular, that it was Carter, not Ronald Reagan, who appointed Paul Volcker to be chair of the Federal Reserve. And, in the United States, it's the Federal Reserve that determines the shape of the economy, not the president. The president has very limited powers beyond appointing the head of the Federal Reserve. So in 1979, Carter appointed Volcker, whom I interviewed for the book not long before he died, to be chair of the Federal Reserve. And um, Volcker told him in the interview that he was going to be independent, that he was not going to do Carter's political bidding. And what he decided to do was to pursue a what was called a monetarist approach, quasi monetarist approach, that entailed raising interest rates in order to squeeze inflation out of the economy. It was very harsh medicine. It didn't start to work until around 1982 when Reagan was president, and it sent the American economy into a tailspin. We had a steep recession in 1982, but it was a very short recession. And when the recession ended in late 1983 and 1984, the economy came roaring back without inflation, which we haven't had for the nearly 40 years since. Now we've got some of it again, but not anywhere near at the rate of that time. So I asked Volcker, I said, you could make an argument, couldn't you, that you elected and re-elected Ronald Reagan? And he said, yes, I've heard that argument. And then he told me a story about how he went to, which I have in the book, about how he saw Carter at a fishing lodge in the 80s, and he said, I'm sorry, President Carter, if I cost you the election. And Carter smiled and said, there were many factors.
Hmm.
I think Carter likes to think that if he just had one more helicopter in the Iran hostage rescue mission in April of 1980, and that mission had succeeded and the hostages had come home, that he would have won the election. But I don't think Carter is right about that. I think for the reasons that you mentioned, the economy would have sunk him. He might not have lost as badly, but I think he still would have lost.
Well, and right now we are having high inflation, but it's for issues that are totally unrelated to the economy. I mean, we have supply chain problems due to the pandemic. It's not because the economy was not running the way it was supposed to be running.
Well, I mean, the causes of inflation are very complicated, and I think even the best economists don't fully understand them. The one that you learned in, Econ 101, that it's too much money chasing too few goods is doesn't really take you very far in analyzing inflation. Carter, the reason it was so bad under Carter is because of energy prices, and we do know that energy prices contribute heavily to inflation, especially double-digit inflation. I mean, what we have now is just, it's annoying, it's irksome, but it's not what it was in the 1970s, starting under Nixon, when the inflation really got going, and it's also not stagflation, which is
Right.
what they had in the 70s, which is a combination of inflation and sluggish growth. Our growth now in the United States is very impressive, and unemployment is down to 4%, which is below what anybody was expecting at this time. So I just wrote an article for the Washington Post, it hasn't come out yet, about the comparison between Biden and Carter on partly on the economy, and it's easy to make these facile comparisons that don't actually hold up that well over time. But I do give Carter high marks for you know looking ahead and trying to do things that would help the country down the road on the environment in particular. He was the first head of state to show any concern with climate change, which was then called carbon pollution, and was only known, some people called it global warming, but it was only known in the scientific community. And where other presidents like to play golf, Carter liked to underline articles in scientific journals. And I found one from when he was governor in his files as governor about global warming, and he'd underlined it and started to concern himself with the issue. And just before he left office, he issued a report on global warming. And if he'd been reelected, we would have been addressing that issue in the early 1980s in some fashion. We wouldn't have shut down the fossil fuel industry because he was trying to achieve energy independence, we would have um, started to move on that, and he already got a whole series of really important environmental bills through Congress, including the Alaska Lands Bill, which uh, set aside large chunks of the state of Alaska from development, and ended up doubling the size of our national park system with one stroke of the pen. So, my overall take on Carter, and we could talk for hours about his many unheralded achievements, both domestically and in foreign policy. My overall take is that his presidency is very underestimated and misunderstood, and he was a political failure, but a substantive and sometimes even visionary success.
Right. Okay. So drawing parallels between Jimmy Carter and, let's say, now current President Biden, Uh, During his time, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and President Carter created this grain embargo. And now we have a similar circumstances where Russia seems like they're going to invade Ukraine, and Joe Biden just mentioned that there could be financial retaliations. I wonder if you have any comments about that, those similarities.
Yeah, I studied this very closely, and I read the minutes of Carter's National Security Council meetings after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan at the beginning of 1980. Um, so you forgot or didn't mention one other similarity, and that is the Olympics.
I
So the
was gonna get
Olympics
to
were
that.
in Moscow in 1980, and Carter boycotted them. This was at first very popular, almost unanimously approved by the U.S. Senate, but pretty quickly people started saying, "Well, why are you taking this out on the athletes?" So you'll notice that Biden now is going to only have a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics, and the athletes are going to get to participate. So that's a lesson that Biden has learned from Carter. The grain embargo was one of the biggest mistakes that Carter made. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union, it was a big mistake because the Soviet Union just bought from other countries. And the problem with sanctions is they have to be pretty airtight or they don't work. And so, there are some hopeful signs for Biden. The pipeline, which Germany just approved, uh, they can. NATO is pretty strong in wanting to shut down, that revenue stream for Moscow if they invade Ukraine. And but it may be that that Russia can just buy from China and India in the way the Soviet Union bought from other countries after it invaded Afghanistan. At the same time, Ukraine is a lot closer to NATO than Afghanistan was, and there were real issues among our allies as to whether the invasion of Afghanistan was really an assault on their strategic interests. So Carter had to do a lot of work with the allies on maintaining a hard line, and some of them boycotted the Olympics, others did not. But you're right that it's a very interesting parallel. There's more warning this time. So the Soviets invaded Afghanistan pretty much without warning after their puppet in Kabul had fallen, and they went in to stabilize. It turned out to be their Vietnam. And actually, I interviewed Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Carter's national security advisor, also not long before he died a few years ago. And it came out actually in a French newspaper uh, some years ago that the summer before the Soviet invasion, we started to fund the Mujahideen, who from Pakistan, who were trying to get the Russians out. So we were trying, on a covert basis, to surreptitiously undermine the Soviet-backed regime. And of course, we were helping the Mujahideen. There was blowback from that at 9/11. So Brzezinski confirmed this French story, and we talked about how he thought that dealing a blow to the Soviet Union uh, was worth the trade-off, even though it helped uh, yield disastrous terrorist consequences in later years.
Um, can I ask you a question about China? At the moment of Carter, he normalized the relationship with China, and I wonder if you could tell us briefly where was China as a political and economical force before Carter, and then I wonder if China had grown maybe a little bit too fast, too big.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you raised that because a very fine writer who also wrote a book about Jimmy Carter, who you interviewed, Kai Bird, he did not find Carter's normalization of relations with China to be important. He just devoted a couple of sentences to it, and I devoted a pretty long chapter to it because the U.S. Chinese bilateral relationship is the foundation of our global economy, for better or sometimes for worse. That is the main strut of the global economy. And at the time Carter normalized relations, and Deng Xiaoping, who's one of the great figures in the 4,000 year history of China, and Deng came to the United States on a state visit. He never left China again. Came to the White House in early 1979, and they normalized relations. They walked through the door that Richard Nixon and Mao Zedong had opened 7 years, nine, yeah, 7 years earlier. Um, there were many ways it might not have happened. At that time, China had the GDP of a sub-Saharan African country. I went 5 years later for the first time to China in 1984, and there were, even then, most people were on bicycles. There were few buildings that had been built since World War II, and their economy was nowhere. And because of this bilateral relationship being established, Deng Xiaoping had the political power to very rapidly legalize private property in China, which had not existed before 1979, and implement a whole series of other reforms. And Carter told me a kind of a funny story. His science advisor, uh, in the follow up conversations to normalization, was sitting with Deng Xiaoping, and he calls Carter, and it's the middle of the night in Washington, and Carter's kind of irritated. He picks up the phone, and his science advisor says, Deng Xiaoping wants to send some students to the United States. He wants to send 1,000 students to the United States. At that time, I think there were only, well, just in the previous few months, they had sent maybe a dozen. At that time, there were about a dozen students. He wanted to send 1,000 or a couple thousand. And Carter's irritated, and he says, "Well, you tell the vice premier." Deng Xiaoping never wanted the top title. He called himself vice premier, even though he was running things. He says, "You tell him that he can send 100,000 if he wants." And he kind of slammed down the phone and went back to bed. Well, now they send 300,000 students to be educated in American universities, and that has, saved a lot of American universities financially, and it's contributed their ability to close this gap. I think the unfortunate thing is that they liberalized economically, but not culturally, or certainly not enough culturally. There was some cultural liberalization. For instance, on the last day of their summit, Deng Xiaoping said to Jimmy Carter, "You've done so much for me, having me here. I'm grateful to you, Mr. President. Is there anything I can do for you?" And Carter said, "When I was a little boy in Georgia, I used to send nickels to Baptist missionaries in China. And so it would be great if you would allow missionaries back in and allow Bibles and churches in China." And Deng Xiaoping said, "Well, let me think about it." And he came back the next day and said, "President Carter, I cannot allow missionaries into China, Christian missionaries. I know you're a very religious Christian, but I just can't do that because at the turn of the century, they were not good to my people, the missionaries. So, but I don't see any reason why we can't have Bibles and churches in China. And he went back and they're state approved churches, but there are now millions of Chinese Christians. And I think, I kind of joked with Carter. I said, I guess that makes you the most successful Christian missionary in the history of the world. And he kind of liked that idea, even though he knew it was a joke.
Is that something that he did often to promote religions with diplomats from other countries?
Yes, he did that with the president, the communist premier of Poland. He did that in South Korea. So he did not, contrary to popular impression, he did not impose his religious views on Americans. He believed in a strong separation of church and state, stronger than his predecessors and successors. He wouldn't have any prayer breakfasts or anything like that, any clergymen in the White House. He would sometimes have a prayer at a cabinet meeting, but he didn't believe in that, and he stripped a Christian school, Bob Jones University, of its tax exempt status when it discriminated against blacks and other minorities. So he wasn't sanctimonious personally at all. Again, contrary to his image, but he was such a man of faith, and he prayed about 30 times a day. That at least a small silent prayer for strength. That on occasion, when he would have a foreign leader and they completed other business, he would try to mention that and mention something about it, but in a way that was in the context of his human rights policy. It wasn't, out of the blue. It related to expanding human rights, and that human rights policy was such a comfort to so many dissidents around the world. I there was a religious figure in Russia who had been imprisoned in the Soviet Union, and he was released in a prisoner swap that the U.S. and the Soviet Union had in the late 1970s, and he came to Plains, went to the church where I just was this past summer, Carter's church in Plains, and he was sitting with Mrs. Carter, and he turned up the sole of his shoe, and he pulled off the heel, and he showed that he'd had a picture of Jimmy Carter in
Wow.
his shoe the whole time that he was in prison. And even non-religious dissidents like Václav Havel, they give him great credit for using what political scientists sometimes call soft power to aid the cause of dissidents and promote human rights around the world. It's especially effective in South America. There were hypocrisies. He supported the Shah of Iran for a long time. He supported Marcos in the Philippines. Um, but there were Cold War realities that trumped human rights. But nonetheless, it was the first time any nation had the human rights of other nations be an important part of their foreign policy. And he established an assistant secretary of state for human rights, and the whole human rights agenda, which had begun in the late 1940s with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but stalled in the decades between then and the 70s. After the 70s, human rights was really on the global agenda, and Ronald Reagan, for all the publicity to the contrary, he basically continued a lot of Carter's human rights policy, and George W. Bush in particular pushed hard on human rights. And you hear Joe Biden talking about it. The only president since Carter who hasn't had the slightest interest in human rights is Donald Trump.
Mm. Uh, President Carter is known as perhaps the most successful ex-president in history. So I wonder if you have any comments about his time after he finished his presidency.
Yeah, I write a fair amount about that in the book, and I also have a lot about his life in the Jim Crow South, which I
Mm.
found fascinating when he was growing up amid white terrorism in one of the meanest counties in Georgia. So I do a lot with both his pre-presidential and post-presidential lives, and I kind of concluded that for all of the accomplishments as a former president, which include tremendous advances in global health, basically took the Carter Center, which he runs, has brought the incidence of guinea worm disease, a very debilitating disease, from 3 million to about 30 cases now in the world, and same effectiveness on a number of other, on a few other diseases. They've done great work monitoring elections around the world. It's important that those monitors be in place. And a few other areas on the peacekeeping front. His big wins were in 1994, both in 1994, where he helped prevent a war in Haiti and another one in North Korea with his very aggressive diplomacy. But I concluded that his post presidency has been tinged a little bit with egotism. He sometimes would upstage his successors and grandstand a little bit. And I have a chapter called Freelance Secretary of State. You know, we can really only have one Secretary of State or one president at a time. And also, when you're not president, you just don't have as much power to change people's lives. And that's why I think that his presidency is underrated and his post presidency is a tad overrated, just because there are limitations to how much you can do. But he has become a kind of a global icon. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, which he should have gotten in 1979 for Camp David. But he finally got it after the turn of the century and deserved it for all of his many years of fighting disease and um, forging peace and waging peace, as he calls it, and stirring hope. And in that sense, he's a world historical figure who is a global inspiration. And he certainly was an inspiration to me. I was working on this book during the Trump administration, mostly, and it was a vacation from Donald Trump. Let me put it that way.
Well, it's certainly endearing when we see pictures of him getting dirty and building houses and,
Yeah,
falling and having accidents and getting up and continue building houses and whatever he's doing
yeah,
for I mean, when you see that on the press, you say what a magnificent guy. It's just and it's hard not to love a person who at his age he could be just watching Netflix, but no, he's out there getting dirty and uh, uh, getting into
yeah.
accidents and still running, trying to improve society in one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate enough. It was just a fantastic experience. I helped him build a house in Memphis, Tennessee in 2016. And he showed me how to hammer, and I wasn't doing a good job hammering. He helped me on that because he is a woodworker. He's a Renaissance man. He knows so many different skills, and woodworking is one of them. He's built all the furniture in his home, and that's just one of many skills he has. He mostly makes his living writing books, not serving on boards or getting paid $1 million for a speech. If he is paid for a speech, it goes to the Carter Center, which helps people. And unfortunately, the builds that he did for Habitat for Humanity, which is an organization that now builds more affordable housing than any other in the world. And he doesn't run Habitat for Humanity, but he's been a kind of a spokesperson for them and chair of their board. And every year, he and Mrs. Carter devoted a week to um, building a house somewhere. And unfortunately, after this most recent fall in 2019, he can't do that anymore, and he just turned 97, and my wife and I were invited to his and Rosalind's 75th wedding anniversary last July, and so his mind is still clear, but he can't get around the way he used to. But he did host President Biden earlier this year, and that was a nice thing to see because for many years, even fellow Democrats shunned Jimmy Carter, and it's nice to see that toward the end of his life, he is being properly appreciated. And my book is warts and all. I've got all of the legitimate criticism of him in there, but I was inspired by him, and I think that people who get a chance to read his very best, which is called his very best because Carter has given it his all in anything that he undertakes. So I'm hoping that people who read his very best come away with it with the same kind of appreciation that I have for a tremendously important global figure.
Well, as I'm reading the book, I feel nothing but admiration. Well, Jonathan, I wonder if you could tell us. I mean, you already tell us the name of the book, his very best. Where can the listeners follow the work that you are doing? You are keeping busy. You are doing many things. You have an amazing newsletter. Tell us something about your newsletter, and then we close the show right there.
Thanks for that opportunity. The book is called His Very Best Jimmy Carter, a Life. And if you go to jonathanalter.com, my website, you can buy it there from the bookseller of your choice, or you can get it whether it's Amazon or some other place or local bookstore. I have a connection to local bookstores that you can buy it through on jonathanalter.com. And then my newsletter is on a platform, the Substack platform, and it's called Old Goats Ruminating with Friends. And what I do there is I write some columns. I was a columnist for many years for Newsweek and Bloomberg and the Daily Beast. I still write for, but I put a lot of my columns on Old Goats, and I also do interviews with people who are in their 60s and above who have done interesting things, people of wisdom and experience. So it might be, Andrew Young, who was Martin Luther King's top aide and closest associate. I did a great interview with him, or Ralph Nader, the great consumer advocate. I did an interview with the comedian Susie Essman, who's on a great show called Curb Your Enthusiasm on American television. They're not all about politics. And I did Al Franken, the former senator from Minnesota and comedian, who's an old friend of mine. So most of these are people who I'm friends with, and we just sit around, and then it's not a podcast. I cut down the interview so that you can read it much faster than you would listen to a podcast, with all due respect to yours. And, acquaint yourself with some of these older people who've done really interesting things. And I call them old goats because some of them are the greatest of all time, and some of them might not be the greatest, and they might just be old and wise.
Well, I don't consider 60 to be old. By the way, I'm 55 now, so
Yeah, you won't qualify. I can't interview you because yeah, you're not old enough
okay.
for
That
old
will give
goats.
me
But
something to look forward to when I turn 60. Then I will
yeah, absolutely.
I will tell
I
you I'm
would love to
ready
have
for
you.
an interview. Well,
I would love
Jonathan,
that.
thank you so much for your time, and I will put all those links in the show notes. I'm so grateful for you highlighting President Carter, and yeah, thank you again.
Thanks a lot, Elaine.